Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to my presentation for SAP Inside Track, the online version, in this case, Refactoring for Dummies. Um, so let's start with the agenda. So as you can see, we have the agenda here on screen. I'm going to go through several topics. This is primarily a theoretical presentation because we could spend hours on doing actual refactoring, but that's not really we don't really have the time to do so. So this is just a brief teaser, um, so you get the idea what refactoring is and whether or not it's something that you should look into uh, after my presentation. So let's begin. What is refactoring? Well, one of the definitions, as you can see here on the screen, how can you make a change to the software to make it easier to understand and cheaper to modify, but it should still be what it is. Uh, if it does A before you refactor, it should still do A after you are done refactoring. So basically you change it, you make it better without actually changing it. Okay, some side notes. It is both a noun and a verb. So the refactoring is both the process, but it's also the change that you're actually making. I'm just putting them all together because otherwise it wouldn't fit on the screen. So, but do know it's actually two. And one other thing that you should take into account when you're talking about refactoring is the two-hat problem. So are you refactoring? Basically, you improve the program without changing the results, or are you adding functionality, or are you working on bug fixing? Ideally, you keep the two of them separate. Either you change the program or you improve the program, or change the functionality, but you should not do both at the same time to avoid complications. And one final thing that you should take into consideration, um, refactoring is not the same as performance tuning. For people who are wondering what the NE stands for, I'm an ABAP developer and I just like the touch. So not equals performance tuning. So we can create a program that runs perfectly, but is a complete mess to understand, but it will run perfectly. So the question is, yeah, what is the, when do you go for performance tuning and when for refactoring? That is up to the business to decide. If performance is absolutely critical, you may have to make some changes that are not ideal regarding refactoring or the structure of the program. So it's a dilemma. Do you do or do you do not? As Yoda would say, try, do or do not. There is no try. Make a choice. Okay. So in the meantime, if somebody has any questions, please hold them until the end of the presentation. There will be time to discuss them. But for now, write them down, put them in the chat. I will get to them at the end of the presentation. So when and why should you refactor? Well, why is of course obvious. The design of the software should be as well as can be. Because if you don't do this, if you mess up the design, it could be that, okay, the program will run, but nobody understands how it runs, why it runs, and nobody even dares to make any changes because, well, they know that it's not going to end well. So try to keep it as pristine as possible. Another point is, okay, it helps to make it easier to understand because you have written a program. Maybe in 6 months' time, you look at the program again, or somebody else looks at your program. You don't know. but chances are you will no longer remember what exactly you have done at that time and why you did it. It's the same as they say for documentation. It's a love letter you write to your future self. Of course, having a decent structure in your program will make it easier to find bugs. If the structure is clear, it is a lot more easy to add new functionality to it. And also, last but not least, it's a matter of professional pride. The code I write for customers is my legacy, not to be confused with legacy code. That's a whole different ballgame. But somebody, and it might not even be me, will be looking at my code in a few months, in a few years, or wherever. And I would really hate that they would then say to their colleagues, well, this guy really made a mess of things. It is completely incomprehensible. And I wonder why he was even paid to do this. And if you think that code will become obsolete after a few years, uh, just this week I'm working for a customer remotely, of course, and I was looking at code that was written 20 years ago. And I even recognized some of the people who did it because they were former colleagues. So yeah, the fact that your code uh, will stay around should be a given. So better make it decent. Okay, so when would you then refactor? Well, there are two viewpoints on that part. One is the opportunistic viewpoint and the planned viewpoint. Uh, Usually, if I look at what I do myself, um, while I'm making changes, I will also know things that should be refactored, or I find typos in documentation or in variables. So I would like to fix them because, well, ideally, you should always leave the code better than you found it, regardless of the functionality you put in there. So what you, for instance, for the prefactoring at the first point, what you could encounter is that that you need to add some code to a function module. But it turns out that the variable that you need for that is not present. So you need to add it. But then you realize that you could use the same variable for another opportunity in the code that you could use. But then the variable needs to be changed. So usually when you start to change functionality, you see how things could be better, clearer, and easier to understand. So usually when you are doing this, comprehension is another item. If I look at code, I will almost certainly see, okay, well, yeah, I understand what you're doing here, but it's not really well documented. And of course, documentation should be as little as possible and as much as you need. So if I can rewrite the code to make it easier to understand, that's also a good point. So comprehension, try to understand your code better, helps a lot. And also look at the other side. If you have developed a program, your program, the knowledge of the program will be in your mind. If you transfer the knowledge of that program to the actual program, not only will it be easier for somebody else who looks at your program, also the chances are that the program will be less forgetful than you are. So if you pick it up in a few years' time, you will still say, yes, that is the reason why I did something. It is better. Now I know what to do, and it will save you time in the future. On the other hand, we have the planned refactoring. I have rarely encountered uh, planned refactoring. I know that, and for the SAP developers among us, this include will be well known. The MV45AFZZ, the sales order entry for the include, where all custom code lives. I have seen that at customers that it is a complete mess because it has been developed for a few decades. and each decade used its own methods to change things. And I've only once encountered it one customer that they actually decided this is not going to fly. We're going to refactor the code and write everything in the modern standard so that it is clear and again useful to go for another 10 years or so. What you could also consider is making it part of the code review. I have worked on a few projects where code review was mandatory. So you could say, okay, well, I have delivered some code. The reviewer goes through the code together with me. And while we are doing this, we tweak it in order to make certain that it still works the way it should work, because I know it, because I've built it. And he looks at the standpoint from, is it working properly? Is it clear? Is it concise? Is it understandable? So, but yeah, I have never encountered that in practicality. But I'm certain that it will happen somewhere. Okay, then again, not every code is relevant to be refactored. Well, one very simple reason is it is not being used. For instance, SAP has done some checks, and I believe that somewhere between 50 or 60% of all custom code was no longer being used. So, for instance, you could run the transactions SCMON or UPL to keep track of what software is actually being used. If it's not being used, don't bother. However, the trick part is there. It may only be used once a year at, say, the year's closing or this disaster recovery. That will not ordinarily be run on a daily basis. At least I don't hope so. So if it's really not used, don't do it, but be careful before you say that it's no longer used. And the second part there is if no modifications are needed. So for instance, if I have an old transaction which is running perfectly, but it's a complete mess, and I can just use it with call transaction, well, then I can just use it as a black box and no need to change it. It will work. I have it documented. Why need to change it? Because if I change, chances are I will make mistakes. And if I make mistakes, my customer will not be happy, and neither will I. So, and that brings us to the last item of this sheet, the dilemma, the rewrite versus the refactor. Occasionally, you can stumble upon a program where the word refactoring is no longer useful because it would just be putting a paint, putting lipstick on a pig. Yeah, it looks better, but it's still a complete mess. The problem is, where is the border between saying, okay, well, I can still refactor this, or no, this is a complete waste of time. We have to rewrite it. And yeah, I don't have any clear guidelines for that. It's probably like Fingerspitzengefühl. You start refactoring and you realize that the amount of work that comes out of it is so immensely huge, it does not make sense to refactor anymore. It's better to rewrite it again. But yeah, usually that requires management buy-in because it will take a lot more time. Okay, so then we get to complications when you're doing refactoring, or complications that are viewed as complications. Because, well, the slowing down of new features, as you can see as the first item, is between quotation marks, because if you do it right, it will not take time. It will become better. However, management may feel that you're doing all kinds of work that are not really relevant. However, you make things relevant by doing the refactoring. So yeah, it can be seen as a problem, and it may be something that you need to discuss with management. How can we make this work for you? Code ownership is a bit more tricky. For instance, if you have created an API and the interface is published and it's being used all over the world in lots of different programs, it is a bit tricky to start changing it because all the programs that are relying on your API will then have a problem. So you need to be careful with that. You could, of course, create a different interface that the old interface is calling, whereas any new development can then use the new interface. But yeah, it's still tricky. So be careful about the ownership of your software. And that's not the legal ownership, but where is it used? So that may be tricky. Branches can, I assume, or that most of my audience is familiar with GitHub. So if you divide your work into several branches and you start to work with it, and you don't merge them until after 2 or 3 weeks, you may end up with a lot of problems. So how can you fix that? Well, you cannot really fix it, but something that will definitely help is continuous integration. Keep your branches short. Try to change it, to merge back, say, once a day at the end of the day. If you have made changes that are incompatible with what somebody else has been doing, you will find out shortly and not after several weeks where it may have been wildly diverged. So it could be a problem. Same as for testing. Uh, Ideally, you change the functionality, but you don't. You don't. No, correction. You keep the functionality the same, but you change the functional structure. But how will you know? You need to test. Ideally, in order to do so, you need to have the automated testing, because you can have a very large test script that you need to run through. But if you need to spend an hour or 2 hours testing everything manually because you have just changed one line of code, you're not really motivated to do it again. However, if you can say, okay, well, I'll just run an automated test by unit tests or whatever trick you use for that, and you just, well, in the meantime, I'll just grab a cup of coffee and I'll be back in 5 minutes and I'll know if it works. You are much more motivated to change or to use the automated tests. Legacy code is also another problem because when we look at testing, one of the definitions of legacy code is code for which no tests have been written. So it is a mess, or rather, it is something that was not written by you. So it is a mess. No tests are available. So can you be certain that if you have made a change to improve it, it will still be working? You don't know. And there are no easy solutions for legacy code. What I can recommend is a book written by Michael Feathers, Working Effectively with Legacy Code, which goes into a lot more detail than I can do here at the moment, how you can handle legacy code. And last but not least, also consider databases. It may be because if you change your function module or your methods or your program or whatever it is you change, it will not influence the database unless you add some data. But if you are to restructure the database, then the main problem will be that you also need to take care of the existing data. So it needs to be converted. And that is something that is a complication that is not normally included in any ordinary development. So if you need to change the database, and I don't mean adding another column or removing a column, but changing the structure, going from a string to a date or vice versa, make certain that you take into account that the existing data is converted and saved. Okay, and then now for the tricky questions. Do I tell my manager? Well, as with everything, it depends. We have three scenarios here. The first one, very simple, there's no need to. That one is also the most optimistic because everything that you want to do, your manager is in agreement with because he's a former developer and he's already familiar with legacy code, with with unit tests, with refactoring. And not only does he feel that it's a good idea, he even thinks it's mandatory. It might just be the company standard. So if you're lucky, it's a part of the package. You don't need to do that. On the negative side, or maybe the positive side, it may be that your manager has no idea what you are talking about and he only sees his delayed deadlines. And yeah, what do you do then? Well, the simple question is it's very easy. Do not tell your manager because if you feel that you need to fix this and it is absolutely worthwhile, make certain that it's part of your estimate. Of course, you should not have an estimate of 3 weeks extra just to refactor the code, because then you have a completely different issue. But just make certain that you have some time in your schedule that you can use for refactoring. If you feel that refactoring is part as a um, what's the word? If you feel that refactoring is part of your professional toolkit, then you should use it, and then you hide it in your average estimate. The medium case is you need to convince your manager that it can be done and that it's worthwhile. And the longer you work with it, the more managers are actually familiar with the modern concepts. Um, but yeah, you may need to have a discussion with him. How can I want to do this, and these are the reasons why I feel that it's necessary. So work with it. For instance, you could use the design stamina hypothesis, which states that, okay, good design is worthwhile. However, if you only do a very small development, if you then spend hours or weeks on making a perfect design, it will take a lot more time than the effort is worth. On the other hand, for highly complicated programs, working without a design will bite you in the backside immensely. So try to avoid that. There is a happy medium in between the design payoff line where you can say, okay, well, up to this point, making a design is worthwhile, or after this point, a design is worthwhile. But yeah, it depends. How many technical skills does your manager have? How up to date is he? And is he somebody who can be convinced? Because not all managers can be convinced. Okay, so now we have a piece of code and we wonder what the problem is. How do we know whether there's a problem with the code? Well, in refactoring, we have this phrase called code smells. So meaning it is something that you discover that is just not right because you keep doing a specific task again and again, or you encounter something that you feel like, nah, this is not ideal. So that is what we call a code smell. What is and what is not a code smell is subjective, and it can vary by developer, by language, or by methodology. But usually, if the code starts to smell, there's something rotten. The question is where. We also have the code stench, and that's the more tricky part because that is a code smell that is so pervasive, so bad, so really, really, really annoying that if you only try to fix that one, you may overlook other issues. And it is so completely bad that you may feel that you need to fix it today without taking care of the proper procedure. So be careful about dealing with a code stench. However, if you now look at our unclean code, let's do some quick refactoring so that we can discuss the contents a bit more. And as you can see, we now have slightly cleaner code. I did a quick refactoring and it now helps. Of course, since I only have 15 minutes left, I'm not going to discuss all of them, so I'll just pick a few and discuss them with you. So for instance, the duplicate code. What can you do about duplicate code? Well, for instance, if it's identical code, maybe you can create a function elsewhere and call the function on the places where you spotted the duplicate code. Is it similar but not identical? Well, maybe you can reorder the code that you're looking at so that you can find a common section that you can then take out and use as a function or as an include or whatever. Another issue is, say you find a similar or the same method in subclasses. Well, the easiest part then is to move it upward to to the main class, to a superclass, and use it there. So it varies. Comments. Comments are not necessarily a code smell. It is more a sweet smell that can be used as a deodorant or abused as a deodorant. Because, for instance, if you look at a program and that is very well documented, because it is completely written out what it says in the code, that could mean two things. Either somebody was really dedicated about documenting, or the code underneath is such a mess that they need an entire bookwork to explain what is happening here so that the next developer who looks at the code is not making the same mistakes as everybody before him has made. So comments are good, but they could also be masking problems. So if you see a lot of columns of comments, be careful. This one is one of my favorites in the code smells, the shotgun surgery. And basically what is meant here, that if you need to make a change, for instance, you need to add a new branch, a production branch to your company, you need to make changes all over the place. Whereas ideally, you would just make a change in one location because everything is nicely compartmentalized and everything is working as it should be. So how can you do something there? Well, it could be, for instance, that, oops, wrong screen, that you can use to move function or move fields. That you go to one class where it's all changed for whatever reason. Maybe you can combine functions into a class. Because if the functions are all over the place, but they all regard for the new company code, move it to a class that handles solely with company codes. What you can also consider, especially if your programs are rather large, and of course, large programs are also not ideal, but it can be used as an intermediary step that you add everything to that class and then rephrase it so that you create an inline class or an inline function, which can, in the end, when you know that you have covered everything, be moved out. But that may be a second phase or a third phase. It doesn't need to be changed all at once at the same time. Baby steps is a perfectly good principle when you're doing refactoring. The code is not going anywhere, so why should you try to fix everything in one go? Change it and make certain that it's working. Another one, and that's rather easy, is the mysterious name. And the standard phrase is, if a name is confusing, it's probably caused by a design problem. So what can you do? Change the variable, change the field, For instance, if you feel that within SAP you only have 30 characters and it's not long enough, make it part of a structure. Then you have 30 characters for the structure itself. So you have 60 characters to play with. So if you cannot make a clear description of your variable in 60 characters, you may need to ask for your money back from your college. And of course, last but not least of these 5 is the large class. Maybe there is a superclass hidden within this large class that you can pick up. Maybe you can split some of the code out to subclasses. There are lots of things that could be happening here. The trick is try to limit it, to make it comprehensible, to make it atomic, if only to be practical, because if you need to wait to change your code because your colleague is now working on the same class and he has locked it in a transport, yeah, it may take some time before you get your work done, which is not what you want. So the more limited the objects are, the easier it is that somebody else can work on it. Ah, okay, so I made a slight boo-boo. I already discussed the solutions for the 5 code smells that I had figured out in the previous slide. So let's have a look at what can we do automated. There are some tools that you can use. For a sub GUI, you have the CC apps, so the custom code cockpit. Within SE24, you have the refactoring assistant. So even in the sub GUI, there are also some options to refactor quickly and easily. But the SE80 and yeah, the sub GUI is about to go the way of the dodo. It will still take some time, but it is stable, so it's not going to change anymore. On the other hand, the Eclipse ABAP development tools are relatively new and are still developed for. So for that, I would also like to recommend you to have a look at SOT307, a presentation that will be given in a few hours' time by Johan Vosleitner. And he is going to give a brief demo of how you can refactor easily in ADT by using the functionality itself. So I can recommend that one if you are interested in how can I use a tool to do the refactoring. Also, what you should take into consideration, how can you refactor safely? Because yes, you want to make certain that the structure of the program is working nicely and that the structure is clear and consistent, but the functionality should still be the same. So how are you going to do it safely? Well, for instance, always make certain that you have a copy of the code you started with. Create a new version or just put it in Notepad, but make certain that you have the code the way you want it so that you can go back if you mess up considerably. Also, try to keep it simple. Big changes can be quick, but they can also include a lot of misery. So try to do it limited, one at a time. I like the next phrase that is written here, build a parking lot. Because if you're going to do A, you might find out, oh, I see B is an issue, or even C or D. But you don't want to do everything at the same time. So focus on A and just put B, C, and D in the parking lot. And once you have done A and A is done correctly, then you say, okay, well, I have some time left. I'm going to do B. And if B is complete, I'll do C. Or I say, okay, well, B and C are not that critical. Let's do D first. So there are options, but Don't do them at the same time. Make frequent checkpoints. Retest. But since you're changing things, it may also be that you need additional test cases to take into consideration what your program is doing at this time. Also, review all changes. At my current customer, even if I write just one line of code or change one line of code, it has to go to peer review. It may be a quick peer review, but nevertheless, it needs to be peer reviewed. Adjust your approach depending on the risk level of the refactoring. So if you just, for instance, if you change a constant to a different value, as I recently had to do, a date was hard-coded and it needed to be the system date, that's a minor change. It took me a few minutes, and the peer review took a few minutes. So it's rather quickly. The test is easy. But if I'm going to do massive refactoring in the program, it needs to be checked thoroughly and not just, oh, I've got 5 minutes before to go to lunch. Let's do it now. It looks fine. Okay. No, make certain that it's done certain. If the risk is considerable, the effort for the refactoring and the peer review should be considerable. And last but not least, consider pair programming. Because if you are doing some refactoring and it is difficult for you to explain it to your partner, it may be, or he doesn't understand it, it may be that this is not a good thing to do for refactoring and they should reconsider it. So, and also, at least that's my experience, if I'm stuck with a problem and I explain it to somebody else, usually it helps for me. It will become clearer to explain. Okay, well, I would also like to recommend two presentations later today. One I've already mentioned, Refactoring in ADT by Johan Visleitner, which will be done today. And depending on your time zone, it will be done in about 2 hours. But you can use that. But also, because that is just a technical presentation, I would like to recommend that you have a look at Paul Hardy's presentation, because, well, I'm just talking about the theory. Johan is talking a bit about the tools, but this poltergeist presentation is about a massive program that had to be changed and refactored. So it's about the practicalities and what kind of issues you can encounter it. So I can recommend this one too. Last but not least, if you want to know more, and I'm certain that you will want to know more, the book Refactoring, but also Code Complete, second edition, is very useful. Look at Wikipedia, there's plenty of information there to find. And there are some decent blogs why we should refactor or how to refactor a monolith. So have a look at it.
Lawrence, there's a minute left and then it'll
Okay.
be cut off. So I recommend that you take the discussions and the questions in one of the unconference rooms.
Okay, I will go to the conference room. So if you have any questions, I will be around in one of the conference rooms later on. And you can also find me on Twitter, or you can send me an email. And I hope that this has been a worthwhile presentation for you. And if you have any questions or remarks or praise, please let me know. Have a great day.
Thank you so much, Lawrence.